When I was a child, my family and I resided in a rural area of the state that hadn't experienced much modernization. We inhabited a tiny hamlet of approximately 93 residents spread across almost 40 square miles. It was nestled deep in the woodlands, and at times it felt like an enchanted realm. At other times, it was utterly frightening. Our settlement, if one could call it that, was interconnected by a system of neglected dirt roads that the county had seemingly abandoned. Potholes and stones bordered the roadways, and it wasn't unusual for dense vegetation to render passage unfeasible until someone cleared it. It was on one of these thoroughfares on a late afternoon in June that this narrative commences. My sibling and I had recently concluded a triathlon of basketball, catch, and swimming. After we had toweled off, our parents instructed us to dress. We were embarking on a blackberry picking excursion. One of the advantages of the rampant foliage along the roads was that a substantial portion consisted of blackberry shrubs, and since they were situated on the roadside and not on private land, we were lawfully permitted to gather as many as we desired. My brother and I were thrilled at the announcement because the annual blackberry yield was transformed into preserves and pies, and also simply consumed after a mere rinsing. Blackberries were our confection. We attired ourselves in thorn-deflecting apparel, long-sleeved cotton shirts, and denim trousers. It was late enough in the day that the intense warmth had diminished to a pleasant 72 degrees, so the full coverage attire wasn't excessively bothersome. My brother and I each procured a container, one of those inexpensive Walmart Easter pails, and we all piled into the minivan. My father navigated us along the road to our usual blackberry location, and we all disembarked. "Don't stray too far," our mother cautioned us as my brother and I scouted for the most productive patch of brambles. We anticipated plump, succulent berries that would undoubtedly stain our fingers and likely be flung at one another in jest. But what we encountered was a letdown. The berries that remained were desiccated, shrunken black husks that had succumbed to the heat of the preceding days. What hadn't been claimed by the sun had been pilfered by avians. We persisted in our search for a few additional minutes, venturing deeper into the thicket, speculating that perhaps due to its thorniness, the birds hadn't penetrated this area, nor had the sunlight pierced the denser foliage. However, the only berries we discovered were of the withered and dehydrated variety. I peered despondently into the depths of the woods, beyond the brambles. I envisioned something lurking there, awaiting our transgression of the thorny boundary into its domain. The berries might have been depleted, but we were two robust, juicy youngsters, ripe for consumption by a creature with countless fangs. I dispelled the notion from my mind, admonishing myself that it was foolishness and that being nearly 13, I needed to eradicate such juvenile fancies. Yet the sensation lingered. The woods harbored marvel and enchantment, but they also concealed entities that prowled in the shadows, beyond the scope of human perception. Having successfully unnerved myself, I prodded my brother and suggested we return and inform our parents of our discoveries. He concurred, somewhat vexed that our undertaking had yielded such meager returns. We navigated our way through the brambles, treading on lifeless vines and displacing the thorny branches that attempted to ensnare us. I re-emerged onto the roadside, my hands adorned with numerous lacerations, but it was no different from any previous year, so I harbored little apprehension. We had attempted utilizing gardening gloves one year, but we invariably ended up either squashing the berries or the gloves becoming snagged on the thorns. Consequently, we determined that bare hands were the optimal approach, so we endured the scratches in exchange for the berries. Our mother and father were reclining against the minivan, containers at their feet, engaged in conversation. They observed us and inquired if we had located any. Our yield was a reflection of theirs. We all re-entered the vehicle and resolved to traverse the road in search of another patch of berries. I gazed out the window the entire duration, conjuring the beast I had envisioned, racing through the woods, catching the scent of my apprehension, and pursuing us. It was voracious and wouldn't cease its pursuit until our flesh was within its maw. I shook my head once more to dispel these notions. An overabundance of Stephen King, I mused. After retracing our route and adopting an alternate path, we discovered a patch of berries that showcased abundant, almost bursting fruit. My spirits ascended as I beheld the berries, my mind expunging all contemplations of the unnamed terror with visions of syrup and jam. Juvenile. Exhilaration surged through my veins as I practically vaulted from the minivan. My mother reiterated the same admonition as before, and we absent-mindedly assented as we hurried across the ditch and into the brambles. The berries were enormous, at least the diameter of a quarter. Some were nearly overripe, and the juices were commencing to seep from the fissures in the flesh. These didn't find their way into the container, but were instead devoured on the spot. We were youthful and dwelled in a remote locale. Consuming unwashed produce wasn't a concern that plagued us. The quantity of blackberries we amassed was substantial. In a mere 5 minutes, I had completely coated the base of my pail by approximately an inch. I transitioned to another shrub when an odor halted me abruptly. It was bittersweet and possessed a saline quality. I summoned my brother and inquired if he could discern it. He inhaled deeply and grimaced. We initially struggled to identify it, but then we recalled a day at school when the classroom's air conditioning unit had malfunctioned, and the identical aroma had permeated the space. Stale water. As we advanced further into the berry patch, the stench intensified. Despite the fact that the berries were considerably larger here, we resolved to retreat and seek another locale. We retraced our path and found ourselves back at the roadside. We overheard our parents traversing the berry bushes and elected to attempt to rejoin them. They had nearly filled their container between them and jestingly inquired why we were so far behind. I recounted the acrid odor to them, and they counseled us to avoid it. Yearning to replenish our pails, we accompanied them in their gathering. The berries in this vicinity were sizable as well, but the stench was absent. We trudged nearly 100 feet from the road into the brambles before encountering a property demarcation. We decided to proceed no further, and instead, my parents proposed that we examine the area where my brother and I had ceased. Despite their prior counsel, I reminded them of this, but they dismissed it with the typical, "We're adults. We comprehend our actions" rationale. Thus, like obedient soldiers, my brother and I trailed our parents into the fray of brambles and thorns. After 5 minutes of harvesting, our parents guided us to the location where we had halted our picking. The aroma lingered in the tranquil summer atmosphere. My father inhaled and declared that it was inconsequential, merely the scent of stagnant water. My mother's eyes widened at the magnitude of the berries, proclaiming how delectable they would be in a pastry. The contemplation of the dessert dispelled the lingering unease in my subconscious, and we commenced gathering. We harvested until each of us possessed a full container, and still more tantalized us as they dangled from the unchecked vines. My mother plucked a berry and deposited it in her mouth, beaming at its sweetness, and my father emulated her, as did my brother and I. A conventional blackberry possesses a delightful sweetness with a faint trace of bitterness, but these were akin to dollops of honey. A solitary berry seemed sweeter than the entire collection we had amassed thus far. Its nectar inundated my mouth and elicited a smile upon my countenance as my eyes widened at the flavor. The fragrance of the masticated fruit permeated my nostrils as I reached for another berry, and yet another. 10 minutes must have elapsed as we mindlessly gorged ourselves on the fruit, oblivious to all else. Popping one final berry into his mouth, my brother glanced up at the darkening heavens. The sun was descending. We had ventured out to the patch around 4 o'clock. Had we truly been harvesting berries for that duration? My father stated, "Let's depart," and we all crammed into the minivan, our bellies replete and our spirits elated. We abstained from supper that evening. Instead, we simply deposited all of our bounty into strainers and rinsed them in the sink, allowing them to drain overnight. I descended into a profound slumber that night. I recall it because it was the final tranquil sleep I would experience for a considerable period. The subsequent morning, I made my way to the kitchen where our parents were bagging, mashing, and cooking the berries. The bagged berries would be frozen and consumed as snacks. The mashed would be transformed into pastries and preserves, the latter of which would be vended to our neighbors, and the cooked berries were being reduced to a syrup for later utilization. During breakfast, I inquired if they required assistance, and they indicated they had it under control, so I roused my brother and persuaded him to embark on a stroll through the woods with me. When we set forth amidst the trees, the sun had just begun to crest the morning clouds. Through the verdant, sparse canopy, the sky blazed a resplendent pink as the morning stars waned from view and the moon stood solitary in the earth's luster. The air was crisp, as it typically was in the woods, and it remained cool. Avian creatures chirped as we traversed the forest with no specific objective in mind for the excursion. We each located a wizard's staff, a gnarled branch, to employ as a walking stick, and we ventured deeper into the woodland. The canopy was denser here, and the sky had begun to assume the pale azure of morning as the pink dissolved into the scattered clouds. We encountered the brook that gurgled through a trench in the earth and commenced tossing pebbles into it. I perceived the rustling of foliage and was instantaneously jolted from my placid state of mind as visions of the unnamed beast from the berry patch inundated my thoughts. I envisioned it lurking behind us, its talons extended from marred hands and its shoulders stooped in anticipation, awaiting the opportune moment to strike. It was enraged. I knew that we had pilfered its berries. It was what we had scented the previous day while gathering. We had appropriated its sustenance, and now we were the sustenance. I tensed as I imagined it stealthily approaching us, yellow drool, dripping from its putrescent teeth, its eyes brimming with malice and an insatiable craving in its belly. I couldn't endure it any longer, and I whirled around, prepared to confront the creature. Nothing. Nothing. A sigh of relief dispelled most of my apprehension, but not all. It was then that my brother emitted a groan. He was on the ground, seated in a fetal posture, clutching his abdomen. I relinquished the pebbles I held and hastened to his side, alarmed. "What's amiss? Are you all right?" He repelled me and bent over to his hands and knees. He shrieked in agony as he clutched his stomach with one hand, and an abrupt torrent of vomit erupted from his mouth. I recoiled in revulsion as it splashed into the creek. His entire body heaved as he collapsed onto his face, regurgitation ejecting from his mouth and nostrils, mingling with the soil. I attempted to elevate him, but he feebly batted me away, muttering something unintelligible before another vocal explosion of emesis oozed from him. He endeavored to sit up, but the manner in which he clutched his abdomen indicated that he was in excessive pain to do so. Instead, as I stood there observing like a helpless imbecile, he smothered his face in the vomit-laden mud as more and more flowed from him with each violent retch, like pus from an infection. Tears streamed down his and my own face as I witnessed my brother writhing in his own regurgitation, incapacitated due to the pain. I stood in dread, uncertain of what action to take, and then it struck me. You see, initially, I believed the urge to vomit was merely a consequence of witnessing him. But then, I experienced the pain. At first it was akin to gaseous discomfort, but then it shifted. The pain wriggled within my viscera, and I felt a scorching column of vomit surge through my esophagus. I wasn't prepared, and it exploded through my clenched lips and out my nose in a blinding agony. The wriggling penetrated deeper into my flesh, and soon I had joined my brother on the ground. The sounds of my own wrenching vomit drowned him out as I shut my eyes and allowed the darkness of my vision to turn white with the blinding pain that surged through me. I wasn't even cognizant of the scalding refuse throttling out of my throat. After a while, time seemed to cease as whatever it was in my guts gnawed away at my being and squirmed deeper into me than I deemed feasible. The scent eventually reached me and induced even more vomit to erupt from me and muddy the ground in which I writhed. It smelled saccharine, like blackberries, as another acidic wave pulsed up through my throat. The blinding white transitioned to gray and ultimately to black. I'm uncertain of the duration that elapsed before I was nudged awake. I resisted opening my eyes, but an abrupt flash of pain blasted my eyelids open as I rolled over into the mud and heaved. Nothing materialized except mucus and saliva, and it was identical for the subsequent 3 heaves. Ultimately, I gained control of my respiration and focused on the pain. It wasn't like earlier, shifting and squirming, but was instead localized to the center of my viscera. It felt like a throbbing mass, but it was tolerable. My brother stood above me, his face and side caked with mud. He reclined on his walking stick and prodded me once more with his foot. "We must return home," he croaked weakly, still clutching his abdomen. I inquired if he also experienced throbbing pain, and he nodded. I arose, and it felt as though every single one of my articulations had sandpaper between them. Desiccated mud adhered to my skin and shirt, redolent of blackberries and earth. With the throbbing pain, the yearning to return home overpowered any volition I possessed to brush off the dried dirt. I laboriously retrieved my own walking stick, and we gradually made our way homeward. Each stride was excruciating. The forest seemed like an endless expanse of infinite trees. The songs of despair whistled through their leaves and branches on the light summer zephyr. No birds chirped, and no animals scurried as we shuffled through the leaf-strewn floor of the forest. And even though my brother ambled beside me, a sense of singularity and impending doom descended upon me, and I felt that at any moment, death would claim me for its own. An immense melancholy pulsed through my veins as the throbbing mass reminded me of my own mortality. There was no future to this life in that instant, and my sole purpose was to endure as we made our way back to our dwelling. Two more surges of emesis found their way through my mouth and onto the earth, and my brother collapsed once. We require home, and mother and father will aid us?" I slurred as I laboriously leaned over to assist him up. After what seemed like an eternity, we perceived our house in the distance through the accursed trees and thicket. Our arms were lacerated to perdition from the branches and thorns of our crawl back to salvation, and the throbbing had shifted once more through my viscera, but the sight of home ignited a hope within me that I cannot articulate. We stumbled drunkenly up the steps to our front entrance, and we feebly turned the doorknob. The aroma that greeted us extinguished the aspirations that our parents would assist us. The scent of saccharine blackberries and earth permeated my nostrils as I collapsed onto the emesis-soaked carpet. My brother stumbled over me as scalding tears of exasperation and agony, streamed down my cheeks. I was reclining face with my mother, her own cheeks flushed crimson. I recall peering into her bloodshot eyes and contemplating that this is how I must appear. The whites of her eyes were rubicund, and her skin, apart from the scarlet flush of her cheeks, was pallid and clammy. A streak of vomit and mucus trickled from her nose as her mouth lay agape. Her labored respiration blew the stench of the berry emesis into my face, compelling a stream of my own refuse to flow from my slack jaw. Her eyes widened as she erupted, splashing my face and mingling with my own. It was a relentless cycle until both of us heaved air. My brother, having overheard our retches, experienced convulsions of his own, and I felt his dampness permeate the carpet and saturate my back. The acrid flavor of it all lingered in my mouth, counteracting its sickly saccharine aroma. I observed as my mother's radiant azure eyes rolled back into her head, and her jaw gaped wider. Her respiration became more strained, and the dread of my own demise was supplanted by the terror of my mother expiring, which inundated my being. I summoned as much fortitude as the pain would permit, and I arose, employing the slippery wall as a buttress. My brother was curled into a fetal posture as I stepped over him. I utilized the wall for support as I sought my father in the stench-ridden house. I discovered him unconscious adjacent to the telephone, which lay on the floor. The identical sickly saccharine purge lay around him, and I comprehended that it had been the berries that had afflicted us. It was the sole element we all had in common. An abrupt surge of pain throbbed through my viscera and compelled me to the floor, where I descended into the emesis-logged carpet. I rolled to my side, the floor moistly squelching beneath me, and I grasped the telephone. Now the elementary act of ambulating to this juncture and reaching for the phone had depleted all my vitality as my labored respiration roughly coursed through my scorched throat. I dialed not 911 and positioned the handset on speaker. After slurring an elucidation to the 911 dispatcher and providing her with our home address, the obscurity of unconsciousness dared to seize me once more. That is, until the throbbing in my viscera abruptly shot into my bowels. No, no, no! I lamented pathetically as I felt a scorching mush roll down my flank and pool into my trouser leg. The throbbing pain was now a stream of searing heat that threatened to extract my internal organs from me. It persisted, with splotches and eruptions of scalding excrement. Helpless sobs racked my frame as I overheard the identical sounds erupt from my father, and the stench of demise arose from our bowels. I felt it flow out of the foot of my trousers and into my footwear as I lay. There, paralyzed, and a novel trepidation strung a chord within me as I felt something wriggle against my leg. No, not something, numerous things. You see, I felt the minuscule prick of insectile legs against my epidermis, as whatever I had discharged from my body crawled over my soiled form. It was animate, and it had been inside of me. Obscurity ultimately claimed me as another spurt erupted from my bowels. I perceived a whiteness when I reawakened. Initially, I surmised that demise had claimed me and that I was in the afterlife, but the audible signal of my pulse informed me otherwise. I became acutely cognizant of a needle in my hand and the uncomfortable inclination of my bed, a medical facility. I endeavored to sit up, but I was excessively feeble. I turned my head and I observed a nurse attired in Minnie Mouse scrubs. I recall those accursed scrubs so vividly, they're seared into my recollection. I remember the expression of astonishment, elation, and relief on the nurse's countenance as I requested water. And I remember the melancholy that traversed her smile like day transforming into night. I received my water, and I relapsed into slumber, pondering why she'd been so despondent. I came to what seemed like mere moments later, but after I purged my mind of obfuscation, the identical nurse in the identical scrubs informed me that it had been more than a week since I had requested the water. Additional IVs were inserted into my arms, and I felt, for the most part, satisfactory. I could discern that she was concealing something from me in the manner her melancholy seemed to maintain itself beneath her exterior. I inquired why she was despondent, and she stated that I would have to await the physician. Over the ensuing 2 days, I gradually recuperated my vigor by consuming soft and liquid sustenance and ambulating slowly to the lavatory. The throbbing pain was no longer extant, though my viscera were exceedingly tender. On the 3rd day, the physician entered. He scrutinized my vital signs for himself, inquired how I was feeling, and then instructed me to brace myself, for he had some unfavorable news. I, to some extent, already comprehended what he was going to convey, and scalding tears commenced to course down my countenance prior to his divulging the tidings. Mother had succumbed to the berries. Her organism had forfeited an excessive quantity of fluids. I wept and informed him that none of this should have transpired. They were merely blackberries. I sobbed snowdily into the physician's lab coat. I wept until all my tears had been expended, and then I wailed until my lungs incinerated with acid and my throat transmuted to dust. The physician embraced me the entire duration, remaining silent and clasping me gently. I wept myself to sleep on his shoulder. I dreamed that my brother and I were back in the brambles, being scrutinized by the beast of the woods. No longer were its shoulders stooped. No longer were its eyes brimming with animosity. Its matted fur undulated in the breeze as it approached us. Neither of us sensed peril from the creature. It halted a few feet in front of us, just behind the barrier of brambles. It opened its maw, revealing hundreds of gleaming, needle-sharp teeth. It spoke, its voice simultaneously profound and high-pitched, like the rumble of thunder intertwined with the shrill of summer cicadas. This terrain is contaminated. All that flourishes here is acrid and lifeless. Refrain from consuming from the bitter earth again. The recompense has been exacted for your transgression. It faded into the somber backdrop of the woods, and my dream gradually merged into something beyond recollection. Over the subsequent week, I regained my vigor through an hour of supplementary therapy and commenced consuming solid nourishment. I was informed that my brother and father had recuperated a substantial degree of their strength and that they were on their path back to optimal health. At the conclusion of the week, my father and brother ambulated into my room, accompanied by a gentleman I had never encountered before. He introduced himself as a bereavement counselor. It was the conventional, "What do you do now?" discourse, and he provided us with an assortment of resources and hotlines to assist us in our grief and recuperation. We enlisted a cleaning crew to refurbish the house and lodged at a motel approximately 30 minutes from home for the ensuing 2 days. One evening, as I was preparing for slumber, my brother detected a sizable blemish on the posterior of my leg. I glanced down and observed a half-dollar-sized rubicund mound with a sickly white apex. I looked at my brother, and he noticed that he possessed one just beneath his sleeve on his upper arm. We brought them to our father's attention, and he stated that he had noticed one on himself as well. He instructed us not to puncture them, as it might precipitate an infection. Figuring that it would merely resolve itself spontaneously, I nestled into bed. The subsequent morning, I was roused into dim illumination by a searing sensation in my leg. Not solely my leg, but everywhere. I whipped back the bedclothes and exclaimed in horror as I observed that my lower extremities were blanketed in sizable blemishes, as were my arms, and I felt tender regions beneath my shirt. Appalled, I commenced bawling as I shook my brother awake to apprise him, but he shrieked in agony, and I felt something scalding ooze onto my hand. My father was roused by the uproar and groaned in discomfort as he rolled in his bed to activate the light and ascertain what was transpiring. As the illumination inundated the room, I perceived that my brother was also cloaked in these mounds, and furthermore, they were pulsating. I glanced at my hand where I had felt the ooze, and I recoiled in revulsion as I observed a maggot inch its way up to my thumb. I collapsed onto the floor in my stupor and felt my own blemishes rupture like cutaneous bubble wrap. I wept in agony as I rose to my knees and felt worm-like maggots, or whatever they were, crawl from all the blemishes all over me, and one after another they emerged from the burst infections and tumbled down me, coated in pus and blood. I overheard the plop against the carpeted floor of the room. "Oh, my deity!" my father exclaimed as he stumbled out of bed, his own infections popping audibly as he slammed into the wall. My brother was somewhat more cautious and laboriously eased himself out of bed. Dad hoisted me up, the pressure from his grip enabling additional maggots to crawl out of each of us, and bolted out of the door with my brother behind us. We returned to the medical facility and the emergency room, balked at the sight of 3 individuals dripping maggots from their epidermis. The individuals in the waiting area either fled in revulsion or stared in horror. We were swept in forthwith, and the identical physician who had permitted me to unleash on his shoulder observed us once more. He stared, medically intrigued, at the profusion of maggots oozing from our collective flesh. We were placed in isolation and administered a plethora of pharmaceuticals. After another sojourn in the hospital, lasting an additional 2 weeks, the maggot pools desiccated. We were compelled to undergo minor surgical procedures to excise each and every maggot pod, and fortunately for all of us, each pod was solely in the epidermis and superficial muscle. They had circumvented our more vital organs, but the physicians were perplexed. They interrogated us relentlessly, and we all alluded to the berries that had rendered us incredibly ill to commence with. A cryopreserved sample of berries was procured from our residence, and after a mere few days of analyzing the berries, we received notification regarding what had afflicted us. Asterisk Oixoptoma novaboracense. Asterisk deposits its ova in the maturing fruit of blackberry shrubs. The larvae of this coleopteran are exceedingly diminutive and consume the flesh and nectar of the fruit. The beetle selects only the most saccharine berries to deposit its eggs in, and it accomplishes this by fissuring the berry and inserting them within. That day, when we engorged ourselves on the berries, we introduced hundreds of these larvae into our bodies, and we had been consumed from the interior outward,